Good evening. Howdy. Hello. Bear with me.
Space Marine Chapter Foundings. The old general looked out at his staff and sneered. It had been a complete success, a total victory. The enemy had been driven before them, then utterly annihilated. The Xenos threat was ended, and his men cheered and drank themselves into stupefaction. But all he could concentrate on was the cost. He knew there should be joy, must be celebration. It was required to keep the spirits of the men high, and they had earned it. But he could not enjoy a single moment, not one. For he would never see his friend again, because they had fallen, all of them. Their drop pod strikes, their fleet engagements, they had bought the time he needed to muster the forces of the Guard, the As Militarum under his command, had smashed the enemy before he even set sail toward them. So that which came on at his ships of the line, the forces on the planets they had infested, they were mere dregs. The heart of the war had been ripped from it before his men even assembled, let alone took the field against them. But in doing so, they had been wiped out. He rose, waving away his attendants with a curt nod and an explanation of fatigue. He left the bawdy ballroom. He went to remember and to mourn.
Okay. I'm ready now. Um this I don't want to call it a story because I feel like calling it that cheapens it somewhat. Um General Mastina to me means a lot, and the story or lore means a great deal to me. This portion of lore is what got me into 40K. Um, it's what pulled me in, and what keeps me coming back. Because, like, the first time I ever heard this one, I ugly cried like a buffoon. Um, I'm not ashamed of it either, because, like, when you hear it, you'll understand. So for me, this segment of 40K is special because I am sharing with you guys what brought me into this and why I love it so much. Um, it's beautiful. is a story not only of bravery, but of true friendship and love and integrity. And it really embodies 40K for me. Um, it's beautiful. I mean, it's tragic, but it's beautiful. Um, I really hope you guys enjoy this. And if you ugly cry, it is totally fine. I did too. And I'm probably going to again because I cry every time I hear this one, but it's moving.
General Mastina usually strode everywhere. His shoulders back, his head high, the air of command that surrounded him, not generated by the stars or medals or rank insignia, but by his countenance, his very being. But not tonight. As he left the light and laughter and loud music of a celebration of victory, a pageant to life, his pose shifted. The shoulders slumped, the head dropped, and his eyes, ever forward, ever on his course, now surveyed the long corridor to his destination, the most secluded spot on the entire station, his most favored place in the galaxy. For it was quiet, an island of calm and tranquility, in an existence of constant buffeting crowds and questioning faces, orders, dispatches, meetings, and direction. He was a conductor of the orchestra that was the Imperium's war machine, a leader amongst a race forever under assault, perpetually one set of mistakes away from extinction, no matter how powerful humanity may seem. Few knew how their entire civilization balanced precariously on the very nice edge. He did. But not because he was a general, had been for a long year even then. Because so many of the generals and leaders of the forces of mankind were insular, siloed, bunkering in their own microcosmic empires. They did not see the bigger picture, because the canvas was too huge, too expansive. But General Mastina had come to see that one tiny segment of the tapestry could reveal more than the dizzying panoramic visage of the whole. All because of his unlikely friend, the one he came to mourn so bitterly. His slow steps rang out. He had his boots cuffed in metal at their sole and at their tip, just for this effect. He had done so because he was so tired of the scurrying and panic movement people performed when he appeared unexpectedly. So the shoes had metal tip and sole, so he announced his arrival way before its advent. But now, the slow clip of his pace echoing along the corridor did nothing but underline the emptiness. The reason he had loved this spot had become the reason he now hated it, because it would now be empty. He knew this, but it hurt. He turned the last corner, and just for 1 second, for one fleeting moment, he closed his eyes as he did so he could pretend, so he could avoid the moment for just 1 second longer. But he could not. He cursed his stupidity, his weakness, as he slowly raised his eyes. And there it was, the small viewport at the end of his journey, but nothing else. He took the paces required to get to the aperture into the void, then just stood there, looking out at the beauty of the nebula. Its colors and lights flickering, it was hypnotic in its sublime perfection. The light shone, and he could feel them twinkling off the light now welling up in his eyes. He was alone, for his friend was not there, and never would be again. He cast his mind back to the first time. How he had been so desperately looking for a spot of sanctuary. His first day on the station. His first command. And yet it had been too much. He had to take an hour to himself before he went to his palatial apartments, the largest on this station. So he had walked and walked, until finally the crowds became occasional passers-by, then on, until none passed him at all. He walked past, then took 2 paces back, and into this one quiet area. The lights had dazzled him so that he missed out on the only other thing there. He lurched mesmerized until he was able to place his hand on the viewport, infinity and beauty in his fingers as he looked out on the nebula. His reverie was interrupted when he took flight and leapt a bunny hop back in shock. Someone had been standing there too, a Goliath in warplate, a statue of perfection. And he looked at the figure that stood beside him so tranquilly. He was a gargantuan, easily over 8 foot in his mammoth armor. Yet his face, his visage, it was calm. His features so pure, his gaze so intent and yet so open. The being was an Astartes, a space marine. From his near-perfect makeup, his long blonde hair, he could be nothing but a son of the angel. Mastina's gaze elicited movement, and it was as if that statue suddenly came to life. He moved slowly, carefully, calmly, turning his head to look down to Mastina. Looking back, General Mastina knew that the angel had moved this way to prevent him from running. For he had seen them in combat, and their merest gesture could terrify and shatter the mind for a moment, could form a rout. For something so large, so powerful, so strong, to move with such alacrity, such precision, it bent the normal laws of reality that the human mind could accept without recoiling. This was a kindness unto itself. As their eyes met, the deep blue of the Astartes was rich and almost kind, as pristine an expression as faced a lie, for within those eyes the pain and struggle of hundreds of years were dancing. Yet also contained within was the passion of a father defending his child, all framed by the ivory perfection of a noble face. He just nodded down at Mastina, before returning to his basking in the beauty of the galaxy. The general did the same, and they both enjoyed the silence together. Not one word was said. Finally, Mastina had turned and saluted the marine, his legs so tired from the transit, and then being on them without a break for 24 hours in this, his first day. He did not want to break the moment, but could not elongate it any longer. He had to rest before the havoc of the day to come. To his surprise, the marine just nodded his head and half smiled, seemingly unable to break his concentration on the viewport. And so the pattern was set, a pattern that lasted over 100 years. For his station was the main stopping-off point in the sector. From here, General Mastina organized the Astra Militarum to meet the threats, and it was here that the blood spears had to dock as they went from one end of the sector to the other, always moving, always fighting. And whenever the Astartes fleet docked for any reason, Mastina would look to his control panels to see if anyone was there, in that place, that sacred spot. And he always was, standing alone, a moment of respite in a world of war and death and pain. Mastina would conclude the business of the day and always, always take the time to go to simply stand with the marine. The Blood Spears chapter was guarding this region of space, so they passed the central stack very often. It took a decade of this until finally it began. Words. Beautiful, isn't it? The perfect angel said, with such passion it shocked Mastina. That was all. And when Mastina never bothered the Marine, never questioned, never said a word, it slowly developed. After a decade more of limited lines, small statements, Mastina answered back, but only briefly at first. While they both basked in the glory of light and colour, of a moment of rest in a world of war, a kinship, a bond was formed. And by the end of it, after more than 8 decades, and a painful rejuve for Mastina, it was a ritual neither would miss. For the angel now spoke to Mastina, telling him of the actions he had fought, where he was going, what they had done. And Mastina would not console, would not praise or simper. He merely listened, calmly, with compassion, but without pity. The list was never ending, no respite ever for his friend. He even brooked this once, the only time he ever did. We move on to Fire Canter Alpha to meet elements of the Navy, the 285th Flotilla. We will be clearing out the Corsairs base your men so ably pinpointed. Then on to Boris 12 to confront the Myrna. Xenos incursions from the nebula are ramping up, old friend. Then, if the Emperor guides our bolters and our warp routes, we will be returning to head to Apollon Secundus for the campaign against the War. A hard decade, this one. With the rift, things are worse, said Mastina. I must ask, in all of the time I have known you, we have never discussed your respite, your core. How can even you go from war to war without breaking, without rest? What do you do to stay sane? The angel looked at him, almost in shock, and he slowly swept out his hand at the vista they both viewed. I have this. That was all he said. These few hours snatched in months of endless engagements. Seconds only, really. Mastina did not know. How could he? He felt ashamed that he had interrupted the angel's only quiet moments, and for 2 visits he let him be. Until on the 3rd visit, a communication came to the deck. The first and ever sent a message. It said simply, your presence is missed. And so Mastina returned to his vigils with him. He felt so
Ouch. If you don't understand, they spent decades side by side, often not speaking a word. And if you misunderstood what he was saying, he was asked him how he could bear all of that pain and war, and asked him what his respite was, and he says, I have this. He wasn't talking about overlooking the galaxy. He was talking about the time he spent with his friend. I think this is probably one of the most beautiful stories in 40K, and it's a hidden gem. Unless you know where to find it, you'll miss it. Be unfortunate. I know it's the most beautiful story to me in 40K. But in case you missed it, he paged him after he thought he wanted some time alone, and he paged him and said, your presence is missed. And for a space marine, that's a lot. That is no small thing for him to have done.
honored. He took notes, many records, and made them a document, a testimony. He'd always written them up in rough and put in the details of locations and battles they had long past, when there was no strategic import anymore. The annals, as Mastina called them, grew. Until that final day. The largest war ever seen in the region had erupted out of nowhere. Rocks slammed into worlds across the sector, and the worst of it was that they made a path straight for the core station. But before that, the pathway took them on a straight line to the chapter planet of the Blood Spears. The regiments were bogged down in long engagements, or on furlough. Standing preparedness had been ground down under the constant conflicts since the warp tear across the galaxy. Many times had command advised that the chapter be permitted to reprovision and to be given a short reprieve to recruit, but they had always refused. Always. The battle barge docked, its small fleet of strike cruisers and supports. All that remained of the chapter's strength that was not already at their home world, preparing for the battle to come. And the angel was there, standing, but he seemed tense when Mastina arrived. By just the tiniest shuffles, the minutest sway, he gave away his disquiet. And then he spoke again, but faster than usual, with good pace, clear, but with a tinge of desperation. He had much to tell. And so they stood, and he told Mastina. He told him his name. He told him how he had become an angel, how he had trained, how he had learned, how he had developed. He told Mastina of all the things he did not know. Nothing a mortal man should not know, of course, but as much as he could tell him, he did. And Mastina knew when he finished. He knew he had told him all of these things because... Mastina saluted him as always, but his finest, sharpest salute. And for the first time ever, the angel turned to him fully and slowly gave the sign of the Aquila and bowed. He went back to the command. He worked and worked until his eyes swam, his vision blurred. It was days before he was forced to rest. He took 6 hours sleep, then returned. He would push his men, would send messages and orders, would smooth every hold-up, remove any of the tiny glitches that slowed a muster by calling even subalterns personally. There would be no delays. He sent out commissars with orders to execute any who caused any form of hold-up. He would get the men ready. For the Blood Spears were facing the full fury of the war, and they could not do it alone. Not at only 40% of their strength. If anyone could do it, if anyone could hold out long enough, it would be them. So Mastina worked harder than he had since he was 20. He was tireless. For once, just this once, he wanted to return the favor. For it to be the forces of his Astra Militarum who came in and saved the day. Not for ego or honor, but because they owed the Blood Spears. So much did they owe them. The Navy finally mustered, his men finally aboard. He took command, but they were too. The Orcs, they believe, and so the Navy swept them before them. But then they found out why. He had known, of course, but most had not. They arrived at the chapter planet of the Blood Spears. When they translated into real space, the system was cluttered with debris. Millions of tons of scrap blasted apart and floating like minefields in their path. So much carnage had the Blood Spears' own ships meted out to the Orcs. The scans showed them all they needed to know. They sent out Mechanicus and Militarum forces. They checked over the still burning wreck of that place, that fortress. The Orcs destroyed everything. They had killed near all of the Marines, beaten them down, smashed their bodies to pulp when they fell. Only one pair of survivors were said to be interned into dreadnoughts. So the Blood Spears were gone. The Orcs had even taken their gene seed and used it for a bonfire, throwing it at walls to see if it would stick. fed it to their horrifying little ball monsters. The bad spears were gone for all time. And so, Mastina had to bring them back. It was revenge only. And when he returned to his post, his headquarters amongst the stars, he wrote his report. He knew nobody would ever take it seriously. It would avail him naught to make his case for a founding. A mere general in an outlying border. He knew he was wasting his time. But it was all he had to spare now. Time. For he never went back to that viewport again. The time he would have spent there, he spent on the annals, to make them perfect, so he could pass them on. Story continued at the conclusion. Welcome, gentle listener. I'm Voldemort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the important forces, factions, and elements of Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace, there is only time for war. And today, we shall be discussing how a chapter of Space Marines is actually formed, both historically and at the very moment. For so much has changed in the setting with the awakening of the Avenging Sun, the Primarch Reboot Guilliman. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. One golden question that many will ask is, why does the Imperium have to create new chapters at all? For surely, the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, are the most powerful of all of the armies in the setting. How could any Xenos, monster, mutant, or demon truly bring them low? And if there are 1,000 chapters of Marines, then why would the Imperium even need to make more of these self-contained armies as super soldiers? Well, I hope my little tale at the beginning shows how this can be required. For the Space Marines are indeed some of the mightiest warriors humanity has ever created, only ever outshone by the incredibly rare action from the Custodian Guard, the Custodes, the very bodyguards of the Master of Mankind, the Emperor. Only they are mightier. Even so, the battles that they fight, the enemies they oppose, the odds they surmount on a daily basis, the Astartes are not invulnerable and not infallible, and they do indeed die. What many forget when they see the Space Marines, what they are and what they do, is the horrific lives they live. They see the armor making each more a walking tank or a superheroic Iron Man, the weapons that can melt, explode, or punch directly through even gods and monsters. Their superior tactics, written by geniuses that not only encompass all of humanity's collective wisdom on the subject, but with battlefield experience from dominating the better part of the galaxy. Their transports that are nigh on indestructible, and with the firepower to level mountains. But it is not necessarily the power of their adversaries and enemies that should be most weighed, as terrifying and mind-boggling as that can be, but their frequency. For the Space Marines never tire, never slack, never rest. When one battle concludes, one campaign is won, they simply move on to the next one immediately. The Imperium stands on the precipice, not despite its size, but because of it. It does not cover a millionth of the amount of stars in our actual galaxy, but they are clustered around the warp routes that are still in place, that are stable, meaning that all other races or powers are after this prime real estate as well. Thus they are under constant attack, constant assault. Tyranids, Orcs, Necrons, Tau, Chaos, Traitors and Mutants, Eldar, Drukhari, and a plethora of Xenos races that have not yet been thrown into the spotlight. Vampires, ghouls, Psych-Nuin, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. The grim darkness of the future is called thus because the human race does indeed dwell in a protracted horror setting where all of the universe is against us. So much so that even the doughty, stoic Marines can be ground down. Though they turn back armies and foes innumerable, each action takes its toll in men and resources, and they cannot always replenish their numbers while fighting these battles. And then some foes, are too much for even these paragons of martial skill and power. Greater demons, shards of Catan star gods, farseers who hail the battlefield with lightning, tower suits that can shoot them from the horizon, orcs who can grow to the size of dreadnoughts. The list goes on. In one event, an entire chapter can be wiped from existence, for there are only 1,000 of them. And against such foes, as well as the general vicissitudes and vagaries of warp or void transit, mishaps, misdirections, and betrayals, the Marines are not as plentiful as one might think. So yes, they die. And yes, sometimes the Imperium of mankind does sluggishly move to rectify the issue. So new foundings are required, but it cannot be understated how much of a tax on the entire Imperium of man this endeavor requires. It is a task of Herculean proportions. Why is a founding called and by whom? We shall go through the foundings in order later. Well, the important ones. But let us discuss how they come about before we explore what is involved. The founding of new Space Marine chapters is a thing of moment. It can only come from the highest body of the entire Imperium, the High Lords of Terra. Nor can it be on a whim. It is never calculated as one would a balance sheet. So they would never say, we lost X amount of chapters, and require Y amount to replenish the numbers, for the Imperium simply does not have that level of automatic efficiency in it anymore. Clogged with administration, bureaucracy, and stifling incompetence, the Imperium lurches more than moves forward. Thus logical analysis is rarely a given. So how are the High Lords convinced to form a new founding? This can be for many reasons. There is a front that requires to be defended. The most obvious would be the Astartes Praeses. These are the chapters of Space Marines that were charged with the defense of the borders of real space around the Eye of Terror, tasked to prevent the chaos-tainted traitor legions from breaking out and attacking the Imperium at whole. Should a new threat appear, then the Strategic Prognostications Department may be aware of it before it truly materializes. By using the Emperor's Tarot, reports from rogue traders and border forces, seeing into the future with the powers of the warp itself by sanctioned psychers. Sometimes, the Imperium actually gets the jump on a situation, and when they're aware of an oncoming war, then sometimes they can move fast enough to enact a new founding to meet this threat. Another reason for a founding is to form the spine of a crusade, usually to regain lost realms, or to push out to counter expansionism from other races or forces. The Imperium does not sit on its thumbs and simply wait for the end. All throughout its history, the Imperium of mankind has struck back, has tried to push out, has never just closed the gates and tried to fully instill the Bastille of the Imperium that Rogel Dawn so wanted. They have always tried to expand. And it is through the use of crusades, with newly formed chapters of Space Marines at their center, that this has been done. But alas, as with everything in the grim darkness of the future, the reality would make a sane man weep. For as the High Lords are merely men or women, humans who see reality from their own perspective, with their own egos involved, it is almost a miracle of biblical proportions for a founding to occur and for them all to agree on it. It may boggle the mind, but some of the High Lords will not wish Marines to be created at all. A bad encounter with the chapter master, a slight, a massacre of men by these godlike beings, by traitor or even just harsh punishment from a loyalist chapter. All can cause resentment in the individual, and the council is definitely made up of individuals. Each Marine in a region makes an Astra Militarum general thankful, but also detracts from their importance by simple dint of not being the only military force protecting the region. The Navy can see each battle barge as either a welcome sight or a potential horror that could turn on them and maul a small fleet. With each of the figures and branches of the High Lords of Terror, there are a million secret agendas as they play the Game of Thrones with each other. Some have even moved against Reboot Gilliman, despite him being the last son of the Emperor, and perhaps the only thing that can save them all. Even so, Elements wish him deleted due to his infraction on what they consider their own power. As they say, anything done by committee is done slowly. Hence it is that a founding is not just a mammoth task materially, but politically. The will must be there, and in accord in nearly every wing of the Imperium, for it is the High Lords entire that are the only ones who can enact the writ of succession and begin the slow process of the creation of chapters of Space Marines. So it is a rare thing indeed. But what happens next? Well, the High Lords finally agree, and then a writ of succession, or multiple writs of succession, are issued. The process begins. Now, some may think that this would be an easy and swift task, but they could not be further from the truth. For it is simply a matter of the scale of the undertaking that they do not factor. The Mechanicus of Mars are instructed to take the gene seed from their stocks and begin the process. They use human subjects to then begin to grow the zygotes required for the gene seed to create 1,000 warriors. And this can take decades to grow and culture safely for implantation into the new Marines. Decades. Each chapter must have a home, a base of operations. Now many chapters are formed around crusading forces. This should sound simple, as their home will be the battle barges and ships which they use to ply the void. But this then means that an entire fleet must be made for them, and each crusading chapter usually has an oversized battle barge at its center, as its flag, so almost a bespoke vehicle. A bespoke ship is a very expensive endeavor. An entire fleet of ships, though, for just one chapter. If the chapter is to be of the other order, to have a home world, then that world must be found. It must either have existing or be able to support a human populace from which the Marines can be taken as aspirants. But it must be a world where life is harsh, conditions are the most severe that make existence there a constant struggle. One that the Marines could quash easily if they just wished to walk from their monasteries with all of their armor and war gear, but one they permit, even endorse, so they can breed the warriors of the future. For it is not mere discipline and training that make a Space Marine. If that were so, then it would be far more practical to make them. No. There is a very special something about the Marine, for at one end they are as far from human as can be imagined. They are creatures without fear, without pity or remorse, things that are not only made for war, but also look forward to it. Yet on the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, the Marines are actually possibly the most human beings in the universe. Oh, you may say. How do you figure that out? Well, simply, because they fight all day, every day, without remit or respite. They kill and crush and burn all throughout their existence. Their every waking hour and thought is directed to war. We all know this. Aye. But have you ever considered that these beings are the most human simply because of the one fact? The pure do not bend. They do not break, and despite all of the horrors that they endure and are forced to perform, they remain human. Some fall to the wayside, and this is shown as a reason for them not to be trusted, but the miracle itself is that they do not all do so within a century of their creation. PTSD, horror unrelenting, the never-ending war would break any of us, no matter how tough we may believe we are. It would change us, twist us, make us into horrors. But the Space Marines walk through hell, yet let no part of it touch them. They stay true to their calling. And that is why the horrors of their culture, the pain that could so easily be eradicated by the Marines themselves, is permitted to continue to forge these men into the beings they must be to endure what is to come. When one looks at it through this lens, it is hard to believe that any of the Marines stay pure at all, stay even slightly human in the midst of all of this. Possibly the most wondrous thing in the entire setting, if I am honest. So the finding of a planet with the right stuff is not easy. Finding a world and then gaining another culture, or even creating one on a world with forced immigration, can be a very real challenge and takes time. Now to the erection itself. Snigger if you must. Each fortress monastery must be unique, as otherwise to siege and defeat one would teach any enemy how to defeat all. So each one must be a thing of power and one of a kind. Hence it is that entire panels will be constructed to choose the military and architectural savants who will sit on the actual planning board. Each one has to be a castle, a bastille of defense that punishes any who assault it, with a dizzying myriad of traps, murder holes, walls, turrets, and parapets. This can take some time unto itself, let alone the building of this huge edifice. Then on to the resources. As stated, Marines have their own ships, so crusading chapter or no, at least 2 battle barges and their support ships will be needed. Now the Navy will not always be grateful that their own quotas are not met while this is all going on. And the lines of manufacturing that must be constructed on Forge Worlds must be factored as well. For power armor is not a thing that is made easily, let alone the lines required for the creation of Terminator armor that the new chapter's first company may or may not gain. And these are not cases of one and done. These are lines of manufacturing that will be required to roll on forever, throwing out bolters and armor and vehicles and equipment until either the chapter or the Forge World are destroyed. Yes, much is made inside the forges of the chapter itself, but not all. So it is not just the mammoth task of creating 1,000 suits of power armor, bolters, grenades, tanks, transports, and drop pods and the like, and it is the ongoing commitment to replenishment that substantially reduces the Forge World's ability to denote productivity to other areas, like super heavy battle tanks for the Guard, or battleships for the Navy. So I hope I've related the scale, depth, and sheer effort that was required to create a founding. Now let us discuss some of the most important foundings that have occurred up to this point. This will be a very brief overview of them. As with some of the foundings, their details are such that I feel we can revisit the topic in the future and expound on the most interesting ones. But let us at least have an overview for today. The first founding. At the dawn of the Imperium, when the Emperor of Mankind arose and created his Custodian Guard, and then his Thunder Warriors. Then finally, distilling the process and its results, he generated the first founding. The Legiones Astartes, the Space Marine legions, were formed. 20 were created, an army for every specialist role or style of warfare, yet all capable of taking a standard field of combat and smashing near any foe that existed in the galaxy. These are the Legiones Astartes, the huge armies of Space Marines that could number over 100,000 men as they went out into the galaxy and grew as they went. For with these 20 legions, the Emperor began his great crusade to find, free, and unify the many disparate worlds and peoples of humanity. It is from these 20 bloodlines that all subsequent Space Marines have come, and every single Space Marine in the 41st millennium traces their existence to these lines, whether they know which or not. With one obvious exception, of course, the Grey Knights. The second founding. After the Horus heresy, while half of the remaining Primarchs and their legions fell to chaos, there was the event called the Scouring. 2 full legions were eradicated, and the histories removed by order of the Emperor himself, even before the events of the heresy. So only 9 legions remained loyal, and chased what was left of their traitor 9 brother legions into the Eye of Terror. When all was done, the legions were smashed. From numbering over hundreds of thousands of Astartes, many were reduced to 3 digits in numbers only. The war over, the Primarch Reboot Gulliman wrote a new structure, a new way of war, an organization of the forces of the entire Imperium, to take the power from the hands of a few and distribute it to the many. Navy could not be ordered by army. Astartes could not directly order either, unless ceded control by the respective admirals and generals. Yet the document he penned, called the Codex Astartes, changed everything for the Space Marines. The legions were disbanded, and their men broken into micro self-sufficient armies of 1,000 Marines only. The chapters. Thus it was that the legions that had more than 1,000 men remaining were broken down, and each 1,000 Marines was grouped into a chapter. Thus it was hoped that if one man went mad, he would not have the power of an entire legion of Marines behind him anymore. For each chapter had its own autonomy, its own chapter master, region, practices, and beliefs. Thus would any demagogue have to gain agreement and support from literally hundreds of people if they were intent on a rebellion, a much harder prospect to achieve. After the heresy, the Marines were as feared as they were admired. The people of the Imperium had shown that the Astartes would never, ever again turn on them en masse. Hence the creation of successor chapters done in the second founding. For if a legion broke itself down, then, for example, all Iron Warriors were still of that lineage, still may admire and attempt to emulate their primarch, their genetic sire, but only 1,000 Astartes, one chapter, would retain the name of Iron Warriors. The other chapters would choose individual names. The third founding, supposedly performed at the request of the Primarch Rogul Dawn of the Imperial Fests. In this event, over 100 writs of succession were drawn up, and chapters were formed. The fourth founding. The Imperium had been brought to its knees by the greatest war of orcs that had been seen since the Great Crusade in Alinor. Attack ships as large as moons had appeared across the breadth of the Imperium and gorged millions of orcs across worlds uncounted. It nearly knocked out the Imperium in the one blow. But that story is for another time. The fourth founding was performed on the diktat of the Lord Commander of the Imperium, Maximus Dane. So desperate had the event been that all power had been concentrated in his hands for a short period. Things were that bad. And it was he who created hundreds of chapters of Space Marines. The 13th founding, the Dark Founding. An enigma in that there seemed to be so much that was not recorded about this founding. In a regime that is known for its choking administrative rigor, it was an anomaly that has given rise to many a speculation. But we shall definitely go into this one at another point. The 21st founding, the Cursed Founding. Aptly named, for the chapters from this founding have had nothing but a cursed existence. Some are unfathomably misfortunate, like the Lamentus chapter, or have developed mutations that could well endanger their existence if the Inquisition were to cast too prying an eye over them, the Black Dragons being in this camp. Now, obviously, there have been many a founding between these numbers, but this does bring us up to one interesting sidebar point. Many will always say that they have looked at the numbers of the recorded legions, how it has happened and when. They quite rightly as well, and almost universally come up to the conclusion there are simply not enough chapters for the numbers that are thrown around. The 1,000 chapters of the Space Marines. Yet I look at this very simply. There is and never was a need for certainty. But why? Simply put, your choice to make up your own homebrewed chapter is not only why there were 2 legions eradicated from the lore, perpetually making a mystery that you can fill yourself. But the foundings are just the highlights to me. They list the chapters the GW want to make into color schemes, may write tales about, but there is always a huge swathe of unnamed and unknown chapters, so we can make our own. It means that each and every one of 100 different fans can make their own chapter, and no two will be the same. They can all attend the same event, match or contest, and every single one of them be not only legitimate, but actually breathe even more life into the strange and seductive setting. Sidebar over. The Ultima Founding. The 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Spoiler had broken Cadia, and by doing so it smashed the linked fortifications of Blackstone Pylons, what is also called Noctilith, and the warp Torah ripped across the entire galaxy. The Cicatrix Maledictum.
I'm happy you came by to see me.
In the years that followed, the forces of hell were led by the twisted traitor legions into real space from this rent. The very galaxy darkened for a time. Communication was impossible, while the Imperium was assailed from all quarters. Xenos, rebels, brigands, and cults all took their turn at the trough, and the days of the Imperium seemed done. Yet out of this darkness, a light arose. For the avenging son, Raoult Guilliman of the Ultramarines, had awoken. He had returned to lead the human race out of darkness. It also transpired that he had set in motion a set of events that would end with Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Quor spending all of the century's election and the awakening of the Primarch on a new form of Space Marine. Thus, when Raoult finally made it to Terra, the center of the power of the Imperium, he was met by the Mechanicus savant, and his labors were revealed. The Primaris Marines. And Belisarius Quor had collected men from the outset of his task all the way to this time. He had made Raoult an army of Marines of all of the lineages. Thus did Raoult embark on his Indomitus campaign. So like the Great Crusade, but in miniature, it went out into the stars and reclaimed world after world. And when the Crusade met embattled and often sieged chapters of Marines, he left them not only the men to bring them up to full chapter strength, but also the technology to create their own Primaris Space Marines. And out of the thousands of these new Marines that Raoult led, he would regularly not only reinforce existing chapters, but would found entire new chapters by simply taking 1,000 of his Primaris and giving them the resources and the remit to take the banner of defending a region or countering a known threat. And so the Indomitus founding gave birth to scores of new chapters. The Space Marines were back, and better than ever. A new form of warrior for a new age of unrelenting war. The Imperium was, for the time being, at least, saved. I hope you can now see the scale of endeavor that is required for the creation of these mighty champions of humanity. The exertion of an entire race to one end, one goal. For of all of its horrors, all its grim darkness, it is the founding of this law that actually gives me most hope for my people, so disconnected by 38,000 years. For while the Space Marines stand on the walls of the Imperium, guard us from the darkness of the void and all that dwell within, then surely there is at least a chance, a slither of one, perhaps, but a chance. So I invite you to take out your Marines, and when time permits, to troop them, to arrange them in their units, ranks and files, to proudly display them. Don't do it for you and your endless enjoyment of the spectacle alone. Do it for them. For in a universe of war, let their banners fly high, for they most certainly have earned the right. For these are no mere toys, no mere objects. What you have on your shelves in your cave, they are symbols, and they are the thin line that protects our future selves from all of the horrors of a galaxy that slavers to consume us all. So give them some damn respect. Troop them. For I guarantee that if you do it right, it will be one day you will not forget. I have been Baltimore, your faithful servant. I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to Space Marine foundings. If so, then please consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications button, as I would not want you to miss out. If you see the worth in what we are doing, then do also consider joining our Patreon, or giving the video a share if that is beyond your present scope. It would be a great boon. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo. And now, back to the end of the story. Times have been hard, and the Reaper now wished his toll. It had been many decades now. We had been cut off from the outside, and communication was almost pointless. Wires had been almost pointless, and were a massive risk to use. I had tried, had done my duty. Another redo, then another. I was not meant to live this long, I think, thought General Mastina. And it was the end. After such a long time, the endless attacks, corsairs, greenskins, the silvered legions of the dead, the predations of a myriad of small pocket Xenos powers that had grown up in our weakness. And we were on the last throw of the dice. As the latest war came ploughing out of the void towards my station, I knew it was over. But we would fight anyway. With near 40% of our previous realm chewed away, we lost resources and manpower. The last assault had been the worst for decades. For without that one chapter of Space Marines, that one force of a mere 1,000 super soldiers, we were lost. They say the Guard fights the wars, the Marines win the battles. But without the Marines to win some of those hardest of all battles, we, the Militarum, had lost. Slowly at first. Then the dam had broken. We faced certain plans of these scum. That's what I thought.
God damn it, Ghost, quit.
Yet when they were closing, eating up the thousands of miles between us, the impossible happened.
What?
A miracle. For out of the warp, a fleet translated. Battle barges, strike cruisers, escorts, and a Astartes force. Sent just they had come. And I could not do anything stare slack-jawed at the screen as the markings came into my vision. It was not possible. They were gone. Then one simple message was beamed from the capital battle barge of 3. It read simply, "To General Mastina, you fought like a tiger over the years, kept the fires burning. But it's time to order your forces to withdraw and stand down. From the Blood Spear's chapter master." Down and on, as the ships of the Astartes force fell into an oh-so-familiar attack pattern. Their vessels were new, their markings freshly painted, but familiar. And the Orc force was smashed within an inch of their finishing line. For if they'd taken this station, the entire sector would have fallen. Yet the fury of the Astartes was unstoppable. And soon all that remained of the invasion force was a scrap field. One he had not seen since that day he translated over a certain fortress monastery world, all those years ago. At the conclusion of the battle, Mastina slumped into his chair for a moment, while his exhausted bridge staff whooped and cheered at their survival, their deliverance. He wiped his face of the sweat there, and then rose. He barked out orders for the next 8 hours, as the Astartes fleet broke up and scouted the entire system for stragglers. The lead battle barge came into dock, and it was irrefutable. The sigils the same, the colours, the banners, all the same. When all was quiet, when all was done, Mastina went to the only place he could think of, just in case. And as he walked, his feet echoed on the hard deck and corridor again. He did so with purpose, and he was not disappointed. For as he turned that corner toward the viewport, there a Marine stood. He had a long cape just off the ground, gold and red in its trim, helm in the crook of his left arm, long blonde hair cascading down his back, like a mantle for his cape. But he stood in the spot. And so, General Mastina slowly paced up to his place and stood, viewing the nebula. And thus, the warrior next to him spoke. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mastina slowly turned his head, but found he had to crane it up even more than he remembered. He had not been around Marines for so long. Had he forgotten their size? The angel broke the silence again. "No, you are not mistaken. I am taller now." And he began his tale, always looking out at the nebula. "You see, I was found by the Mechanicum, my body broken, barely alive.
God damn it.
They interned me in the dreadnought then, when the spears were disbanded. Nothing left to remain for. They placed me in another chapter. I had thought that the end. I fought and was awoken again, slept and awoken again. But in all of that time, something else was afoot. You see, someone had sent a message, a plea to the High Lords of Terror, a request for a founding. It never got there, but it was received by the Indomitus Crusade, something I will explain later. At first, it was ignored along with so many other transmissions, but one ensign read it. He took it to his data slate and read it for weeks, every line, every paragraph, and he gave it to others, and they gave it to others. And slowly, by slowly, it rose through the ranks. Until finally, 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance. A man that is not a man, a leader that is more a god, the son of the Emperor, Reboot Gilliman himself, read it. For all that was going on, it was so compelling, so honest, so true, that is what he told me, that he could not stop reading it. And he took action. He had men of the blood with him in his grey shields, but more than this, he asked one question that nobody else would. Are any of them left? Even one? And so it was that I was found. I was born, and he spoke to me himself, offered me this, and I accepted. They took me from my dreadnought, performed a surgery on me that seemed unlikely to work. Only Mark Naeus Calgard received this before and lived, but they made me whole again. They made me Primaris. And then he, Reboot Gilliman, made me the chapter master, and he gave me all of the men, ships, and support I would need. So the blood spears are back. We are here now. Because of you. Because you wrote that annal of my words. Because you sent it out when anybody else would have put it on a wall for their own posterity. Because of you. Thank you, Mastina. You have no idea what it was like without you and the spears. We lost so much. The angel now stretched out his much larger arm and simply put his hand on the general's shoulder. Did not look at him, continued to look out at the stars, and simply said, Don't worry, Mastina. We are returned. We shall take it all back. And the blood spears will stand with you, your men, your women. We will win the battles you cannot fight. We will endure. We will fight together in the name of the Emperor until the stars themselves burn cold.
God damn it. It gets me every fucking time. Now I hope you understand why that particular lore means so much to me. Like I said before, it is heart-wrenching and it will make you ugly cry. But it's beautiful, and it's a story of true friendship, of a friend who never gave up on their friend. And it's probably one of the most beautiful stories. Well, it is the most beautiful story to me in 40K. The second most beautiful story in 40K to me would be Rogel Dorn. Is incomparable in the weight and gravity of it. And it's tragic, but it's beautiful. And where most of my love for 40K stems from. Now we will hear the second story of General Mastina, which is called Bolters. And if you play 40K, you know what a bolter is. It's basically the origin story of the bolter. And it also is a beautiful story. I'm going to start it
The
from the
astronaut's
beginning
face and many of the...
because I was listening to it earlier.
It is the weapon of his angels of death, his space marines. It is the bolter. And an incredibly brief word from the sponsors of this video. 1 minute 15 seconds. The artifact says personalized video. It's gorgeous. It looks as good as it sounds, and it's hilariously good fun. Raid is putting out a cornucopia of special events and tournaments with some amazing prizes, champions, shards, and oodles more. And if you're not playing Raid yet, then hit my link in the description, or scan the techno thingy on the screen. You'll get a huge birthday package worth $40. We're talking 3 free champions at once: Misericord, Tiger Soul, Romero, plus 10 magical XP brews, 10 Force XP brews, 10 Spirit brews. That's huge. And all this treasure will be waiting for you here. And since it's Raid's birthday, all new and existing players can get a bunch of free birthday gifts worth over $25. Woo! Once you're in game, after clicking on the links, just enter promo code 3YearsRaid to get your hands on everything. Just click the link in the description and I'll see you in the game. Raid Shadow Legends. Start your legend today. And now, to the story.
I love how he just went from all of that to his chill voice. I love him.
General Mastina looked out on the field, the place that had been torn to pieces over weeks of fighting. Hard fighting. Fighting he and his men had not
Disclaimer
been winning.
here, this story will break
They
your
had taken the
fucking
barrages.
heart.
Men and women evaporated in heat explosions, thrown into the air and scattered over the defenses.
Incredibly important that you listen to it.
But they had endured. But they had not been able to stop the enemy. Counterattacks had been pushed back. Outflanking maneuvers and repositioning had bought them time, split the most forceful assaults.
With my lights again.
But now, finally, they had run out of time. The last push had broken through 2 rings of defenses.
My house is haunted.
And they were now within striking distance of his CNC. The rebels. The scum. Mastina had spat teeth and fire when he had been informed. One of their own. A human world. A world guided by the Emperor's light, long protected by his armies. It was one of the region's most important manufactorums. It provided him with a good 1/10 of his arms each year. And it had rebelled. Why? Mastina had been livid. After everything they had suffered, everything they had done for these slack-jawed inner worlds, his men and women had died in their millions, had fought tooth and nail, had always protected everything that could be protected, had taken back near all of the losses of the dark days, when they did not have the support they now had. Yet these scum came tyranny, slavery. The life was not worth living under the Imperium. Popinjays and fops all. Their nobility had become rich, fat, and lazy. But worse, they had become rebellious, so plumped with their own conceit were they. But none of them had fought. None of them knew the horrors that existed in the darkness of the void. None of them had any idea what life would be like under the Necrons, the Orcs, the Eldar, the Zathin, the Sort. Mastina knew all too well that he was at fault, sort of. For he had always assumed that the inner worlds, their populations, would know what had been done in their name. How could they not know? But on the voyage here, he had been very introspective. He had not even sent out picts or vids. He had not had his glorious men march in victory parades. He had not lauded his own victories. He had assumed that they knew. But how could they? None of the regiments that fought were from their world, so they could not feel the losses. No connection to the troops. They had no knowledge of any of it. He, General Mastina, had treated them like children. He had not only shielded them from the enemy, he had shielded them from the horrible truth of it. The terrifying truth that it only took a few successive errors, a string of defeats, and the entire region would be lost. It almost had, before his friend had returned. And his friend had been so busy. It seemed even more so than before, all those years ago when he was a foot shorter. But the two always met, even now. Even with 3 campaigns of reclamation in full swing, it was the only life was to awaken to casualty reports, engagement notes and tally, then to his day of command, then back to sleep, but not before an entry. Each and every night the general would add to his annals the records that had been so effective in making the impossible happen. He had been performing this ritual for decades, and it was the only thing he ever did for himself. And even then, it was truly for his friend. So when Mastina had heard of the rebellion, he was livid, incandescent. So livid, he made a massive miscalculation. He had thought that his arrival would quell the rebellion immediately. He refused to cancel or denude Strike Force data of any of its resources. It was a reclamation formation, and was needed to hit at the eastern fringe to back up the other strike forces, take some heat from the southern front, and claim as many worlds for the Imperium again as possible. So when he left to stamp on the throat of every noble in the court, he had taken the reserves and replenishment forces. But they were not veterans. He had thought it would be a fait accompli. So off he went with a small flotilla of naval transports and a few escorts, all filled with his green troops. The arrival was a shock unto itself, for the world had lowered themselves to hiring raiders. They had engaged a small pirate fleet to assist them, of course, allowing the pirates to use their world as a base, a safe haven. They truly knew no depths of depravity and treachery. And when the Imperial naval ships arrived, it was a close-knife fight straight off the bat. The brigands soon beat a retreat, being used to preying on the weak and defenseless. Even the escort ships of the line were more than their match, but it meant that the Navy would need to stay on high alert, could not descend into the upper atmosphere and bombard the enemy. Mastina and his men would need to win this one on the ground. When the landers came down, a good percentage were knocked out of the air, crashing to the ground and incinerating those thousands of men and women inside. Waste. A damn waste of life, thought Mastina, when he managed to arrange a CNC. And it did not get better from there.
No,
For the
it did
traitors
not.
had been planning this for years, had harbored arms, kept back supplies and armor intended for the front. All the time Mastina and his soldiers had been fighting, these peculating slime had been slowly constricting his reinforcements. They had planned this for decades. So when his men marched from their landers, It was almost instant carnage. His troops had the training, the discipline, the coordination, but the rebels had the advantage of local knowledge, knew every inch of their world, and they had enough armor, weapons, and homegrown troops, as badly trained as they were, to form an entire reclamation expedition of their own. Mastina was enraged, and thus he made more mistakes. Mistakes he would never have made before. And it was now, after being pushed back in an ever-decreasing circle, that the enemy had offered parley. They had offered to meet, to discuss surrender. The entire command room had gone silent when the comms officer had read out the message to their lord. Mastina had nodded, then thought. Those seconds were punctuated by the blipping of screens and the clank of metal, but not a man or woman there even breathed as they looked at their ancient commander. Finally, General Mastina walked to the Auspex officer and indicated one last scan. And it was then that a single ship came out of the Mandeville point. One. But it was too distant to make out, to even detect its size, let alone its course or loyalty. But Mastina just looked down and slowly took out his pistol. A few closest to him almost rose, holding themselves into their seats with white knuckles. Surely not. Not Mastina. He would not do it. His fingers caressed across the gift. A bolt pistol from his friend. The highest sign of respect possible, worth more than any medal, any accolade. And his friend had made it himself. With the aid of the tech marines of the chapter, he had wanted to carve every line, sheen every angle. He had done it himself. And all in the room breathed an exhaled sigh when Mastina finally put it back into its holster. He looked at the screen again, the single ship, and he closed his eyes hard, scrunching them in his forehead. Then he snapped his eyes open and looked around the room. And he smiled as he made the sign of the Aquila. All present rose and responded. His arms now swung down to his side as usual. He was always orderly, economic in his movements. Mastina had then chuckled and responded clearly and almost jovially. Yes, we will meet them. Tell them we require a day of grace, a cycle of cessation of combat, before we meet them, as a sign of good faith. The deck was silent. Had their lord finally cracked? Had he given up? None knew. But the signal was silent, and within 2 hours the firing had ceased. The enemy did not need to shell men who were about to surrender. And so the day arrived. Mastina had refused a dozen requests for people to go in his stead, some rather forcefully. It could be a trap. But the old general waved them all away, or merely deployed his much-vaunted sneer, the one that informed the officer in question that his suggestion was so stupid that he would not even deign to answer it. He stood in his best-dressed uniform, and that worried his men a lot. His honor guard was wary and kept between him and the enemy lines during that long trudge. For the dawn had shown the enemy were already in place. They had even erected a huge marquee as a venue. Mastina had watched them for an hour. Out there on the plain, a gaggle of dandies on fops all congregated around a canopy, and had fine amasec and rare dainty nibbles brought out to them on trays. To them, this was a moment of utter victory, and they wanted to see it all. The nobility had gathered to watch him surrender. But Mastina walked tall, strode to them as if he were the one in the better position. His lines were silent as he took his first steps up the planks and gangways into no man's land. The opposition gave up a cry of exultation as he appeared. The banners of every Astra Militarum regiment there in his possession. It was a spectacle, all right. The nobles giggled and pointed as they thought he was playing along, giving them the respect they were due. When they got closer, one of the nobility, obviously their leader, moved to the highest point of a small hill. The Marquis sat behind it, so that all could witness this historic moment. His men decked out in ridiculous sashes and medals and awards. Not one of them had been earned in combat. Mastina wanted to vomit. His honor guard let our slowly building growl at the effrontery of it all. For they were his men. Despite being considered green only weeks before, they had been blooded and had taken 3 lives for every one of theirs lost. And Mastina was proud of every last one of them. Proud. His own entourage marched to place, then stamped as they stopped. The general walking through an open corridor between his guards. He walked tall as he approached the rise. He ascended it easily, but steadily, and looked into the eyes of the maggot who was standing there. Said enormously corpulent slug had a wide smile on his face as the general marched the last 50 paces to then stop 10 paces between them. Mastina wanted all to hear, so he stood at this distance away, so the noble would have to project. But the fool had construed this as a sign of fear, of cowardice. "Welcome, welcome, General Mastina, legend of the Imperium," said the Ethno. "And who am I addressing?" said Mastina. "I am Ethnarch Pandamas, the first among equals, the lord of the planet and all who reside on it, all who visit it, including, it seems, you." "Very nice. I am sure that impresses whatever catamites you may have hidden under those rolls of fat." At that, the Ethnarch grimaced. "It would behoove you to be civil, General. I can only be magnanimous to another of high blood, high breeding. Do not force me to treat you as low-born. At least think of your valiant troops when you address me, for your actions will reflect on them, and how they are treated thereafter." "Thereafter what, you bloated turd?" The Ethnarch's face, and many of those looking on, curled into grimaces at the continued breach of decorum. Some put their hands over the ears of their children, who were present. A few even fainted at the crassness on display. Mastina was wrecking their little event, going off script. "Well then, let me be as colourful as yourself. I can curse with the best of them. Get on your bloody knees. Get down in the dirt. And crawl. Crawl to me and kiss my ring." As he said this, the Ethnarch raised his hand, which had a magnificent jewel attached to it by a wide band of gold, opulence at its finest. "Or shall I have my men force you to kiss my other ring?" Tittering chortles and mock-affronted gasps at the colourful discourse were rampant behind the Ethnarch. Mastina then looked at his chronometer, slow and steady. He then smiled a wolfish smile at the Ethnarch, as he dramatically held his hand over his eyes to shade them, looking into the skies. As he did this, all about them did the same. His guard, the gathered nobility, their forces. And they could make out tiny teardrop-shaped lumps of metal screeching out of the skies. Tiny, but getting bigger. Mastina then took down his shading hand and fixed a steely gaze on the Ethnarch. "Listen up, fatso. You are a dead man. But if you surrender right now, in this very instant, I will signal my friend to stop his assault." "What? How dare you? Your men are beaten. Your troops litter across the lands. A few reinforcements from orbit are not going to save you. Get on your knees. Now, General." Mastina looked down and shook his head slowly, before raising it again. "Okay, do it the hard way. I'm going to stand here until you surrender. Let's see what happens, shall we? But every minute I stand here will cost your world 1% more of your tithe. Do it for your people, Ethnarch. But do it now. The Ethnarch stood transfixed, puce in face, apoplectic with rage, yet unaccustomed to being denied. His jaws flapped, and he huffed and puffed. In a normal situation, he would order his men to slay the affronting party immediately. But he and his guards took one look at Mastina and his men. They had never seen them up close, you see. And the steely gaze of the general now sent shivers down his spine. The look of his guard, a barely contained rage, around which was set scarred sinews and rugged determination. No, the Ethnarch would not order a shooting match start here while he was in such close proximity to these men. But he was the victor, surely. Why would Mastina not admit this? Why? And then the sound happened. At first, it was a few muffled explosions as these teardrops crashed to the earth. But the sound of the impact was as nothing to the thunder that followed. It was as if 100 storms were going off at the same time, despite the cloudless blue skies. Thunder echoed across the battlefield, across no man's land, but it was coming from the side of the rebel lines, and it was getting closer. The nobility now cowered, but not the Ethnarch himself. He still looked at Mastina, as if he were attempting to get him to surrender by sheer will alone. But as it got even closer, the sound, the thunder, the Ethnarch's poise evaporated. What? What is that? The general responded. That? You have never heard that. Holy Throne, you think to rebel against the Imperium, yet you have no idea what it is, what we do, why, how. That you do not even recognize this sound. I've never even heard it. That means I have been too good at my job. I have mollycoddled you all, and this is my reward. Reward? Yes. This moment, right now. You see, I have been waiting for it since our second week of engagement. I underestimated you, all of you. How cowardly you have been to harbour such forces. How selfish to not give them to the war effort. How pathetic that you have never truly read any reports, even as an Ethnarch. I have underestimated your weakness, your venal egotism, your hubris. And despite all of my errors, this is my reward. To be here the moment it happens, to look in your eyes as it happens. The Ethnarch took a step back and wailed. What? What is that sound? Tell me! I command it! That is the echo of terror. That is the sound of retribution. That is the sound of holy bolter fired in wrath. That is the sound of the Emperor's vengeance. That is the sound of his angels of death. As the last words were spat from the general's mouth, the eyes of the Ethnarch became the size of saucers. His jaw dropped, and his legs shook. And it was also the moment that a fast-moving vehicle came skimming out of the rebel lines. Above them, explosions of fire, screams of the dead and dying, the panicked and the broken, all washed across the plain toward the waiting dignitaries. The vehicle was so fast that it circled the two groups on the small raised area. The nobles all screaming and throwing themselves to the floor, many weeping at being in danger for perhaps the first time in their lives. The Imperial Guard contingent stood prouder, their shoulders back a little further, their chests puffed a little more. They knew exactly who had arrived by his banners, in person. The fast vehicle then skimmed in and hovered above the two men on the hill, and something huge came out of it. The massive bulk landed on the ground, throwing up sod that covered the Ethnarch, who was now wailing and slowly folding into himself as he went down onto his knees. The huge being stood tall again, his war plate sparkling in the sun, his long cape barely above the ground, his iron halo cresting his power-armored head. A chapter master of the Adeptus Astartes, of the Space Marines, a living legend. He reached up and took off his helmet as he took a few paces and stood before his friend, General Mastina. Mastina beamed up at the golden blonde warrior that towered over him. "You took your time." "Many apologies, old friend. A tussle with the sword, tricky fighting," said the huge space marine. "This is becoming a bit of a habit." "What? You coming in at the last minute to save the day?" "Excuse me," said the marine, as he whipped out his bolt pistol and casually shot over his shoulder at the ethnarch. The bolt round flew into his head, penetrating and then exploding. The sound was wet, and even at this distance, flecks of blood and brain matter spattered both Mastina and the marine. The ethnarch's guards had already fled. The marine then took one step forward. With lightning-fast reflexes, he took the handkerchief that the general had in his sleeve, and he began to wipe Mastina's uniform. All stood aghast as the marine cleaned the old man, like a doting mother clucking over her child. "Sorry about the mess, old friend. As you very well know, saving the day is what I was born to do. And when it comes to you, it isn't just an honor. It isn't just a duty. It is a pleasure." He then stepped back, job done, and raised a salute. "My men will break all last resistance. We must be swift, old friend. We are both needed on the southern fringe. It's getting dicey out there, and the men need you to stiffen their resolve. Orchestrate them, as you always have." The rebels, they had not seen bolters in action, nor fought against the Space Marines. The world gave its unconditional surrender exactly 22.5 minutes after the first bolter was fired, and never, ever rebelled again. Welcome, gentle listener. I am Voldemort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the factions, forces, and war gear of the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future, where there is no time for peace. There is only time for war. And today, we shall finally be dealing with the most iconic and important of all weapons in the arsenal of the Imperium of Mankind. Holy Bolter. The weapon of the Adeptus Astartes, the Emperor's own Space Marines. For it can be said, without a shadow of doubt, that it is the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines, who are the only force capable of achieving near-universal dominance of the Milky Way galaxy. Near. Had the Horus Heresy never occurred, then surely they would have managed it. For none could stand before the legions and hope to survive. But it is not merely the bolter that makes the victory. It is the hands that hold them. For bolters are seen as sacred in the grim darkness of the far future. But their lethality cannot be truly compromised, cannot be fully fathomed in a vacuum. For it is the wielders of these mighty weapons that make the synergy so effective. And so, as usual, for the very basics, let us lean on existing wisdom. To quote the standard Adeptus Astartes, Mark 5B, Godwin Pattern Bolter. The bolter, also called a bolt gun, and its variants, are some of the most powerful handheld ballistic anti-personnel weaponry in use by the military forces of the Imperium of Man. It is a powerful assault weapon that fires explosive kinetic rounds colloquially referred to as bolts. The bolt is a weapon synonymous with the Adeptus Astartes, and rightly so. However, although the Space Marines are its primary users, the bolter finds itself in use in military organizations throughout the Imperium. The weapon is fearsome, with explosive rounds capable of ripping through or blowing apart a foe. The Chaos Space Marines of the Traitor Legions were issued their Legion's bolters before the Horus Heresy, and therefore used generally older variants than the patterns available to present-day Loyalist Space Marines. The bolter is a mid-range anti-personnel ballistic weapon that lies between the lighter and more compact bolt pistol sidearm and the more effective but more cumbersome heavy bolter. The most common standard patterns of bolter can easily be wielded by a Space Marine, but on account of their size and weight, smaller human-scale pattern bolters are used by the battle sisters of the Adeptus Sororitas. History. The bolt gun, or bolter as it is also known, has been the standard armament of the Adeptus Astartes for as long as Space Marines have defended the Imperium. But this was not always the case. The ancient Space Marine legions once used Volkite weapons, a class of powerful thermal ray weapons whose technology is pre-Imperial in origin and dates back to the Age of Strife. These compact weapons possess considerable killing power, surpassing most other armaments of their size. But unfortunately, Volkite weapons of the various types were difficult to manufacture, even for the most able of the Mechanicum's forges, and the demands of the expanding Great Crusade in the 30th millennium swiftly overwhelmed the supply of these relic weapons. Furthermore, Volkite armaments were somewhat lacking in effective range, and had high maintenance requirements that were unsuitable for the wartime needs of the burgeoning Crusade. Once relatively common within the fledgling Space Marine legions, Volkite weapons had fallen largely from favor by the time of the Horus Heresy in the 31st millennium, and had been surpassed by the far more flexible and utilitarian Terran bolter. End quote. But what does it do? What is the bolter? A bolter is not just a big rifle. It is a hand cannon. It is a thing of sheer terror inducement. It breaks the morale of the enemy as it smashes into them and penetrates their armor, burrows into their body. The first difference between it and a normal ballistic weapon is its target. The bolt is struck, of course, and has a charge that will propel it from the bow at a hearty speed, but this is not the entirety. For the recoil is not as some have said. Old war was a strange thing, and is often misquoted. For it was said that firing a bolter would smash the arm of whoever fired it if they were not Astartes. But in more modern lore, this is simply not the case, the item being defined much better than it was. For each and every bolt fired has a self-propelling element. It does not just get shot to the target in one thunderous push. It actually flies under its own propulsion, increasing in speed as it eats the yards between it and its target. A bolt that has an armored-piercing tip, made of a hardened diamantine tip. It can slice through armor like a welder's torch through ice. When inside the armor, when inside the body, it has a time-delayed explosion that will wait that fraction of a second between impact and detonation to make sure it is firmly within the body of the foe before it does so. Hence the bolter fires truly horrific munitions. Imagine standing in a line of mere mortal men and women as your colleagues endure bolter fire. Your friends not just getting killed, but their bodies or heads exploding, sending bone fragments and offal across all around them. It is a rare formation that are trained so well as to be able to maintain cohesion and sanity and order under such fire. Rare indeed. But it is the sound as much as the effect that really puts a cat amongst the pigeons. It is like rolling thunder, deafeningly loud. A wave of sound that assaults the opponent like a wall of force as much as a mere sound. And bolters are linked to the heads-up display in a Marine's helm, which shows its ammunition, ranges and targets. It is an integrated part of the whole. A Space Marine. It is a brutish, barbaric weapon, but it is seen as sacred. To even own an Astartes bolt round is illegal. To own an Astartes patterned bolter itself is seen as sacrilege for anyone who is not a Space Marine. There are so many versions which are created from differing forged worlds, from chapters who have made slight alterations to meet their tactical needs. They can be carried by the orders militant of the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle. But these are smaller forms than those carried and used by the genetically enhanced warriors of the Space Marines. much smaller. Now to their magazines. To quote, Sickle Magazine. The standard issue magazine seen on most bolter patterns. The magazine shape is slightly curved to take up less space and carries 20 to 30 bolts. Straight magazine. A straight version of the Sickle magazine. It holds about 10 to 20 bolts, but is easier to load in more intense situations. Drum magazine. Drum magazines are relatively rare sights in the 41st millennium. This is due to their unreliability. Drum magazines have an unfortunate tendency to jam. However, drums can carry up to 40 to 60 or even 100 bolts, negating the need to reload as often.
This ghost is
They
getting
are
on my
also
fucking
frequently used
nerves
on
because
storm
it keeps
bolters
flickering
or
the
in brutal
lights.
assaults where running empty in a firefight can mean certain death. Belt fed. Some troops forego using magazines at all,
ghost.
preferring to feed the bolts directly into the firing chamber using a linked belt. Because the belt is exposed to the elements, it is frequently clogged with dirt or dust. This can, like the drum magazine, lead to jamming, and is rarely used within the Imperium. However, it is very commonly used by the Chaos Space Marines of the Ruinous Powers.
Hey, is this?
Note the Space Marine heavy bolters have the ammunition belt protected by a tough,
is playing with the lights. So if you see flickering, it's the ghost.
And again, let it never be forgotten that the bolter is the weapon of the Astartes and the Adeptor.
I'm used to it, so it doesn't bother me,
and abilities where its true strength rests.
I'm just letting you know that
that's what that is. Fired by these ultra-elite units. A bolter in the hands of an Ogren would be lethal, but it would never have claimed the galaxy. It is in the ability to put a bolt in the eye of a diving hawk at 100 meters distance. It is the accuracy to hit the joints or head, or even the weapons of an enemy, that make it the nemesis of every single foe of the Imperium of mankind. And long may its roar be heard across the galaxy. For when it screams its hatred of the witch, the mutant, the Xenos, the traitor, then the human race still has a fighting chance. I have been Voldemort, your faithful servant. Now I have to admit the time has been against me for this week, due to bugs and colds. Yuck. So this entry cannot be as expansive as I would have liked. But in the future, I shall show you the differing ammunition, special rounds, specific designs, and niche models that make up the family of this holy bolter. And I look forward to that moment, for it is in the multi-purpose utility of the weapon that its true strength shines. And that will necessitate a whopper of a tale to show these many gruesome and outlandish bolt types. I hope you will join me when we continue the discussion and see the true might of this, the most iconic weapon in all of Warhammer, the bolter. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.
Toodaloo. If you haven't, I strongly suggest you go and subscribe to Voldemort, who is the narrator of these. And he is insanely talented, and I adore him. He's really the only one I listen to. I mean, I listen to a couple of them.
The 13th Black Crusade. As I write this, death stalks Cadia. My name is...
But if you haven't listened to him, I would recommend it. But anyway, I am going to end this 40K episode, and I'm going to start another one in about 30 to 45 minutes. I'm aware that I probably won't get a lot of views because it won't notify you, but it's mostly just to have the video. I know I'll be doing it live, but it's easier to do it that way for me. So I'm going to end this here, and when I come back, I think I'm going to do the Ravens, which are essentially they're assassins, and they're amazing. And it was between that or the Space Wolves. I never finished the Space Wolves, so I may finish that one. But we'll see. But the thing is, I'm going to end this one here because that was the end of the stories for General Mastina. And I love him so much. And if I find more lore in my research, I will start titling these so that they go together so you can easily find them. Like if you want different factions, say if you like the Space Wolves, I will do each one that's connected to the Space Wolves and like put in the description so that you can find each faction a little easier in my videos because this is an ongoing thing. I did something similar to that with Rogaldorn. I did the Black Templars, Imperial Fist, and Rogaldorn's lore. Imperial Fist, Black Templars, and Rogaldorn are all connected because they came from Rogaldorn. They're all connected in the lore. And I intend on doing that with the Space Wolves, the Ravens, and so on and so forth. They will all be connected so that if you're looking for a specific storyline, it'll be easy to find and track. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this. I know I have. I always enjoy General Messina's lore because that's what got me into 40K to begin with. And why it's so important to me. I felt like I wanted to share with you guys where my story began. Like why I'm here with the 40K. And maybe now you understand. And I've probably sent you down a rabbit hole now. But that's okay because 40K is amazing. But anyway, thank you for hanging out with me. I will be back with surprise lore because I have no idea which one I'm doing next. And I will see you there. Thank you for hanging out. All right, bye.